Welcome to another enchanting bedtime story with Terranash, where dreams are woven from words and carried by whispers. Tonight, let me take you to a magical land wrapped in endless winter, where snowflakes dance like falling stars and secrets lie frozen beneath the ice. Close your eyes, settle into the warmth of your blankets, and let the chill of Frosthaven's eternal snowstorm fade into the cozy glow of your imagination. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. You can also support us on our Patreon, where you'll gain early access to all our stories. Take a deep breath, feel the softness of the pillow beneath you, and let yourself drift gently into the world of the Icicle Prince, a tale of friendship, courage, and the magic of a warm heart. Chapter 1. The Eternal Winter. Frosthaven was a land of wonder and sorrow, a place where the beauty of winter held its people captive. Snow blanketed the ground so thickly that roads disappeared, and frost adorned every window like delicate lace. The sun, though never far, seemed trapped behind an endless shroud of clouds, casting a pale light that neither warmed nor comforted. Frosthaven's people lived their lives in muted tones, their days defined by survival, and their nights by stories whispered around fires. One story stood above the rest, a legend of a palace hidden in the mountains, carved from the purest ice. It was said to shimmer like a star in the night, but remain unreachable, protected by unrelenting storms and an air of loneliness. Few dared to seek it, and those who did never returned. Among the travellers who roamed Frosthaven's frozen plains was Lila, a girl who carried warmth not in her hands, but in her spirit. Her heart was a beacon, a small flicker of light that even the coldest winds could not extinguish. She wandered, not for riches or glory, but for the joy of discovery and the hope of finding a place to belong. On this particular day, the snow fell heavier than ever, and the wind howled with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. The blizzard's fury obscured the world around her, but Lila pressed on, her determination as steady as her heartbeat. As the hours passed, her vision blurred, and her strength began to wane. She clutched her cloak tighter, her breath visible in the icy air. Just as despair threatened to take hold, a faint glow appeared in the distance, soft and inviting. The sight gave her new energy, and she stumbled forward, each step a victory against the cold. The glow grew brighter, revealing the legendary palace of ice. Its towering spires glistened with a silvery sheen, and its walls sparkled as though embedded with stars. The storm seemed to part around it, leaving the air still and quiet, as if the palace existed in a world of its own. Lila hesitated at the entrance, marveling at the intricate carvings of snowflakes and swirling frost patterns that adorned the doors. Summoning her courage, she pushed them open and stepped inside. The air within was colder than she expected, yet it lacked the bitterness of the storm outside. The halls stretched endlessly, their floors smooth as glass, and their walls translucent, capturing and refracting the faint light from unseen sources. A strange warmth flickered through her, not from the air, but from a sense of being watched, not with malice, but with curiosity. Lila paused, her breath catching. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice echoing softly. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible, yet she felt no fear, only intrigue. She took another step, her boots crunching softly on the icy floor. As she ventured deeper into the palace, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Unseen eyes seemed to follow her every move, and though she saw no one, the air carried a presence she couldn't explain. Somewhere within the palace, Kael, the Icicle Prince, watched her from the shadows. He had long since given up hope of anyone finding him, let alone stepping into his frozen world. Yet here she was, a girl unlike anyone he had ever known, her warmth reaching even the corners of his icy heart. He dared not speak, his curse holding him back, but for the first time in years, he felt the faintest flicker of something he had almost forgotten. Hope, Chapter 2. A Silent Greeting. The Ice Palace felt like a dream come to life, its grandeur both intimidating and inviting. Lila walked through its vast halls, her footsteps echoing faintly against the crystalline walls. Every corner seemed alive with quiet beauty. Frozen chandeliers hung like glistening constellations, and the walls refracted her reflection into countless shimmering fragments. She couldn't help but marvel at the craftsmanship, wondering who could have created such a masterpiece. The palace felt ancient, yet untouched, as though time itself had been frozen alongside the endless winter. As she ventured deeper, the stillness of the palace became more palpable. It wasn't the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something unseen, something that filled the air like a quiet hum. Her breaths came out in soft puffs of mist, her heartbeat steady but aware of the silence pressing in around her. She paused before a grand staircase that spiraled upward, its railings etched with delicate frost patterns resembling blooming flowers. The sight of them was oddly comforting, a small reminder of life in a place that seemed devoid of it. "Hello?" she called again, her voice a soft plea against the emptiness. "Is anyone here?" Kael lingered nearby, his invisible form leaning against the icy banister. He had seen countless winters pass in this palace, but never had anyone stepped into it with such wonder in their eyes. Her voice reached him like a melody, fragile yet persistent, warming the corners of his lonely existence. He wanted to speak, to let her know she wasn't alone, but the curse held him back. His form was invisible, his words unheard unless he allowed them to be. And after so many years of isolation, he wasn't sure how to begin. Lila felt a faint shift in the air, as though the palace itself had exhaled. She turned quickly, her eyes scanning the grand hall behind her, but nothing moved. The silence was unnerving, yet she couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched, not by something malicious, but by someone curious. Her intuition told her to stay, though most would have turned back. Finding a small alcove by a frost-covered window, she sat down to rest. Outside, the storm raged on, its winds screaming like wild spirits. But inside, the palace was calm. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, well-worn book of stories, its cover faded from years of travel. Opening it to a familiar tale, she began to read aloud, her voice filling the space with warmth and rhythm. Kael froze as her words echoed through the hall. It had been so long since he had heard another voice, let alone one that carried such comfort. Her reading was unhurried, each word weaving a gentle spell. He drifted closer, drawn to her voice like a moth to a flame, though he remained unseen. As Lila finished the story, she closed the book with a soft sigh. "I don't know if anyone's listening," she said, glancing around the empty hall. "But I hope that wherever you are, you know you're not alone." The sincerity in her words struck Kael like the first sunlight after a storm. He felt a longing to answer her, to reach out, but he hesitated. What if his curse frightened her? What if she left as quickly as she came? He decided, for now, to stay silent, his presence marked only by the faintest flicker of warmth in the frozen air. That night, as Lila drifted into an uneasy sleep on a plush yet icy couch in one of the grand sitting rooms, Kael watched over her. He couldn't explain why, but her arrival had stirred something in him, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the endless winter in his heart could one day melt. For the first time in years, the palace didn't feel quite so cold. Chapter 3. The Hidden Voice. Lila awoke to a curious sight. The first rays of pale morning light filtered through the frosted windows, illuminating the intricate designs carved into the icy walls. But what caught her attention wasn't the beauty of the palace. It was the silver tray resting on the low table before her. Upon it sat a steaming cup of tea, the fragrant aroma of herbs wafting up to her, mingling with the crisp chill of the air. She blinked in surprise, sitting up and glancing around the room. She had seen no one the night before, and yet someone had clearly prepared this for her. "Hello?" she called, her voice more hopeful than afraid. Silence met her. Still, the gesture felt warm and deliberate, so she reached for the tea, cupping it in her cold hands. The heat seeped into her fingers, bringing a small smile to her face. As she sipped, she noticed other small changes. The fireplace, though encased in ice, flickered with a soft bluish flame, and a chair opposite her seemed to have been pulled closer, as though someone had sat there and watched over her. "You're here, aren't you?" she asked aloud, addressing the unseen presence she had sensed the day before. Kael stood nearby, his invisible form poised against the doorway. Her words startled him, though he knew she couldn't see him. He had spent the night debating whether to reveal himself. After years of silence, the idea of speaking to another person felt overwhelming. Yet her kindness and determination had stirred something in him, a need to connect. "You don't have to hide," she added softly, her gaze sweeping the empty room. "I can feel you. Whoever you are, I'm not afraid." Her voice carried a sincerity that disarmed Kael. He had spent so long convinced that no one could ever accept his cursed existence, yet here she was, open and unafraid. Gathering his courage, he allowed his voice to break the silence for the first time in years. "I am Kael," he said, his tone soft and hesitant. Lila froze, her breath catching. The voice was low and calm, carrying a warmth that stood in contrast to the icy air around her. "Kael," she repeated, testing the name. "You're the one who made this place, aren't you?" He hesitated. "In a way, it has been my home for as long as I can remember." "Where are you?" she asked, glancing around. "I am here," he replied, a note of sadness in his voice, "but you cannot see me. I am bound by a curse, doomed to remain invisible and tied to this palace for eternity." Lila's brow furrowed, her heart aching for the unseen figure. "A curse?" "Yes," Kael admitted, his voice growing steadier. "Long ago, a sorceress cursed me. I was young and foolish, and my actions angered her. She took away my presence, my form, and made me a prisoner of my own loneliness. Since then, no one has been able to see or hear me, until now." Lila set her tea down, her resolve strengthening. "But I can hear you, Kael. I may not see you, but you're not invisible to me." Her words sent a ripple through Kael's frozen heart, a warmth he hadn't felt in centuries. "Why did you come here?" he asked, his voice filled with cautious hope. "I was looking for shelter from the storm," she said simply. "But now that I'm here, I think I was meant to find you." Kael felt a flicker of something he barely recognized. Hope. He didn't understand why this girl, so full of warmth and determination, had come into his frozen world, but her presence was undeniable. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his curse begin to lift, if only slightly. Lila stood, her gaze sweeping the room as if searching for his hidden form. "I don't know much about curses," she said. "But I do know that no one deserves to be alone. If you'll let me, I want to help you, Kael. He was silent for a long moment, the enormity of her offer sinking in. You would stay? He asked quietly. Lila smiled, her warmth reaching even where she thought he might be. Of course. After all, I've always loved a good challenge. Kael couldn't help but laugh softly, the sound echoing like a melody through the room. Though his curse remained, something had changed. For the first time in years, the palace no longer felt like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something new. Chapter 4. The Curse's Roots. The grand library of the Ice Palace stretched endlessly, its towering shelves carved from crystal-clear ice, each containing rows of ancient tomes and scrolls. The room shimmered faintly, illuminated by a soft bluish light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Lila wandered through its aisles with a sense of awe, her fingers grazing the spines of books that seemed impossibly old. "This place is incredible," she murmured. "It's like the history of the world is frozen in here." Kael, though unseen, stood nearby. He felt a mixture of pride and melancholy as he watched her explore. "It is one of the few treasures I've been able to preserve," he said. His voice carried a wistfulness that tugged at Lila's heart. She turned, facing the direction of his voice. "You must have spent so much time here, alone with all of this knowledge. Didn't you ever feel trapped?" Kael hesitated before answering. "At first, yes, but over time, I found comfort in these books. They became my companions, their stories filling the silence. Yet no matter how many pages I turned, I could never escape the loneliness." Lila's heart ached for him. "How did it happen, Kael? How did you end up cursed and bound to this place?" He paused, the weight of the memory almost too much to bear. "It was many years ago," he began, his voice tinged with sorrow. "I was a prince, the youngest of my family, and tasked with guarding this palace. It was a simpler time, filled with feasts and festivals, laughter and life. But then she came, a sorceress named Isolde." Lila leaned against a frosted table, listening intently. "She appeared one winter's evening, during the annual celebration of the solstice," Kael continued. "Her beauty was striking, her presence commanding. She claimed to seek refuge, much like you did. But her true intentions were far darker. Isolde sought the power hidden within the palace, a magic tied to the land's eternal winter. A magic I was sworn to protect." "What happened?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did what I thought was right," Kael said. "I refused her, barred her from accessing the palace's secrets. But Isolde did not take rejection lightly. She cursed me, binding me to this place and ensuring that no one could see, hear, or touch me. To make matters worse, she extended her malice to the entire land, casting Frosthaven into an unending winter. She claimed that only the warmth of a true bond, one formed by kindness and courage, could break the curse. But I had no one to share such a bond with." Lila was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of his story. "So you've been here all this time, hoping someone would come?" Kael's voice softened. "At first I hoped, but as the years passed, hope faded into resignation. I came to believe that no one would ever find me, and even if they did, they would surely leave. But then you arrived." Lila's gaze swept across the grand library, imagining the lonely prince wandering these halls for centuries, waiting for a miracle. "I'm here now," she said firmly, "and I'm not going to leave you to face this alone." Kael felt a warmth in her words that he hadn't known in centuries. "Why would you do that? You owe me nothing." Lila smiled, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be seen, Kael. Everyone deserves a chance to be free. Her words struck him deeply, the sincerity in her voice breaking through the icy walls he had built around his heart. As they stood there, a strange thing happened. A nearby book fell from its shelf, its ancient pages fluttering open as it landed on the frozen floor. Lila picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing the intricate runes etched on its cover. "What's this?" Kael's voice grew thoughtful. "That book. It's one of the oldest in the palace. It might contain something about the curse." Lila opened the book, her eyes scanning the faded text. Though much of it was in a language she couldn't understand, one phrase stood out, glowing faintly on the page. "The shard that reflects the soul shall break the winter's hold." "What does it mean?" Lila asked, her brow furrowing. "I don't know," Kael admitted. "But if it can help us understand the curse, we must find out." Lila nodded, determination lighting her face. "Then we'll figure it out, together." Kael felt a spark of something he hadn't dared to feel in centuries, hope. Though the road ahead was uncertain, for the first time, he didn't feel so alone. Together, they would unravel the mysteries of the curse and face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 5. The Shard of the Soul. The day passed slowly as Lila and Kael pored over the ancient tome, its faded pages revealing bits and pieces of forgotten magic and cryptic prophecies. The book's runes and symbols twisted before their eyes, many of them unintelligible, but one phrase kept coming back to them like a whisper in the wind. "The shard that reflects the soul shall break the winter's hold." Lila sat cross-legged on the icy floor, the book spread before her, her brow furrowed with concentration. "A shard," she mused. "That's clear enough. But a shard of what?" Kael hovered nearby, his invisible presence filled with anticipation. "Perhaps it refers to something of great power, a piece of something whole, a symbol of unity or love or courage, something that could reflect the core of a person's being." His voice trailed off, uncertain. Lila closed her eyes, running her fingers over the delicate crystalline patterns that adorned the book's pages. Her mind raced with possibilities. What could this shard be, and where would they find it? "I wish I could be of more help," Kael said, his voice carrying a trace of regret. "But I've spent centuries in this palace, reading every book, studying every legend, and none of them offer any answers." Lila's voice was soft but steady as she responded, "We'll figure it out. We have time, don't we?" The question hung in the air, but neither of them could answer it. Time had a different meaning in this frozen palace, where the seasons passed without change. But even in this timeless place, they both felt a sense of urgency, an unspoken understanding that they couldn't afford to wait too long. As evening settled over the palace, Lila stood and stretched her arms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and she wrapped her cloak tightly around her shoulders. "Let's take a break," she suggested. "Maybe we'll see something we missed if we step away for a bit." Kael, though he couldn't be seen, followed her lead, walking beside her in spirit. "Where do you want to go?" Lila's eyes scanned the vast space of the palace, looking for something new. She had been exploring every corner of this frozen kingdom, but something about tonight felt different. She felt an urge to walk deeper into the heart of the palace, past the grand library and the empty chambers. She wanted to see the heart of the ice that had kept Kael bound for so long. "I think I need to see the source of the curse," she said after a moment. I think the shard might be hidden there." Kael's voice seemed to hesitate, though he didn't speak for long. "The source of the curse," he repeated slowly. "You mean the heart of the palace?" Lila nodded. "Yes. If the curse is tied to this place, it must have a source. Maybe if we find it, we'll understand more about the shard and what we need to do to break the curse. Together, they moved through the palace, walking past rooms filled with ice sculptures and halls lined with frost-covered windows. The further they ventured, the more still the air became, until it felt as though the very walls were holding their breath. Finally, they reached the central chamber of the palace, a vast, circular room dominated by a single, towering ice pillar at its center. It was the tallest thing Lila had ever seen, stretching up into the sky like a frozen tree, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Lila stood still for a moment, awe washing over her. The pillar seemed to hum with an ancient energy, its presence both majestic and unsettling. The longer she looked at it, the more she felt as though the palace itself was watching her, waiting. Kael's voice, soft and distant, broke the silence. That is the heart of the palace. It is where the curse began. It's also the source of the eternal winter that has held me prisoner all these years. Lila stepped closer, her breath visible in the freezing air. "It's beautiful," she murmured, though the beauty was tinged with a haunting sadness. She reached out a hand toward the pillar, her fingers trembling with the cold, but just as she was about to touch it, Kael's voice stopped her. "Don't touch it," he warned urgently. "It's dangerous. The curse is bound to it. If you touch it, you could be pulled into its power, and I don't want you to get hurt." Lila paused, her hand hovering just inches from the icy surface. She could feel the pulse of energy emanating from the pillar, and for a moment, it seemed to beckon her, like an invitation to uncover its deepest secrets. But then she remembered Kael's words and the hesitation in his voice. "I won't risk it," she said softly, lowering her hand. "But we need to understand it if we're going to break the curse." Kael's voice carried a hint of relief. "Thank you," he said, though his words were almost lost in the vastness of the chamber. "For a long time, I've been too afraid to face it. But your presence, it gives me courage." Lila smiled, her heart lightening at his words. "We'll figure this out, together." She took a step back, her gaze never leaving the shimmering pillar. If the shard was hidden here, it was buried deep within the heart of the palace. But what was it? And how would they find it? As she pondered the mystery, a soft glow began to pulse from within the pillar, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something glowing faintly, just beneath the surface. A shard, perhaps? Or was it merely a trick of the light? Lila stepped closer again, her heart racing with anticipation. Whatever the answer was, it was here, waiting, just beneath the surface of the ice. Chapter 6. The Shard Revealed. The eerie silence of the chamber grew heavier as Lila stood before the towering ice pillar. Its surface gleamed like a frozen mirror, reflecting the dim, bluish light that filled the room. The faint glow she had seen moments ago pulsed again, its rhythm steady and hypnotic, like a heartbeat within the palace itself. Lila could feel it, a strange pull toward the pillar, a sense that it was alive, as though it was watching her, waiting for something. Kael's voice broke the stillness. "What is it, Lila? Do you see something?" His words were filled with curiosity and unease, as though he feared what might happen if she went any further. Lila nodded, though Kael could not see her. "There's something inside. A glow, deep within the ice." Her eyes fixed on the pillar, her mind racing. "I think it's the shard. The one from the book. It has to be." The more she looked, the clearer the glow became. It wasn't just light. It was a shape, something shifting beneath the ice, as though it were waiting to be uncovered. The glow seemed to pulse in response to her presence, as though it recognized her. Lila stepped closer, drawn by an undeniable force. Her breath clouded in the cold air, but her heart beat faster, each thrum in her chest syncing with the rhythm of the glowing shard. She could almost feel its energy, ancient and powerful, calling to her, urging her to uncover it. Kael's voice was softer now, almost a whisper. "Lila, be careful. That shard. It may be the key to breaking the curse, but I don't know what will happen if you touch it." Lila's gaze never wavered from the glowing shard. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. "But we won't know unless we try. I've come this far, Kael. I'm not going to turn back now." She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the frozen surface of the pillar. The moment her skin made contact, the air around her seemed to tremble, a low hum vibrating through the room. The ice was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. But the shard beneath it felt warm, pulsing with a life of its own. For a long moment, nothing happened. The glow from the shard seemed to dim, as though it were hesitating, unsure of what was to come. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the ice surrounding it cracked, splintering outward like the breaking of glass. The shard, now free from its icy prison, rose from the center of the pillar, glowing with an intense, radiant light. Lila staggered back, shielding her eyes from the brilliance of the shard. The room seemed to spin as the light grew brighter, almost blinding in its intensity. She could hear the faint sound of ice shattering around her, the echoes of the ancient curse being broken piece by piece. Kael's voice was barely audible, a mix of disbelief and wonder. It's happening." Lila stood frozen in place, her heart racing as she watched the shard float gently toward her, its light now a soft, warm glow. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and grasped it. The moment her skin made contact with the shard, the room seemed to breathe in with a deep, collective sigh. The air became warmer, the cold receding slightly, as though the curse that had gripped the palace for so long was finally loosening its hold. For a brief moment, everything was still. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, but she felt a calmness settle over her, like the quiet before a storm. Then, in a burst of warmth, the light from the shard enveloped her, and she felt a strange connection, as if she were linked to something much greater than herself. She could feel Kael, his presence growing stronger in the space around her, his loneliness, his longing. It all flooded through her, and in that moment, she understood. The shard was not just a physical object. It was a reflection of Kael's heart, his soul bound to this place, trapped within the cold of the palace for centuries. The warmth from the shard began to spread outward, melting the frost around her, loosening the grip of the curse. The freezing cold in the room began to recede, the air softening, as though the land itself were waking up from a long, harsh slumber. "Kael," Lila whispered, her voice full of wonder and tenderness. "It's working. The curse is breaking." She could feel the warmth of the shard radiating through her, filling her with a sense of peace, and at the same time, a deep ache for all the years Kael had spent in isolation. She held the shard tighter, as if in doing so, she could bring him closer, make him whole again. Kael's voice, now clearer than ever, reverberated through the air. "Lila, I can feel it. I can feel the warmth. For the first time in so long, I can feel everything. Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she closed her fingers around the shard, her heart swelling with a sense of hope and relief. Kael, I'm here. You're not alone anymore. As the warmth from the shard spread throughout the room, Kael's form began to shift, his presence growing more tangible. The faint outlines of his shape appeared, like a mirage, and slowly, inch by inch, he began to solidify. The invisible figure she had spoken to for so long was finally coming into focus. Lila took a step forward, unable to contain the joy rising within her. Kael, is that really you? The figure before her was faint at first, like mist, but with each passing second it grew clearer. Kael's features emerged slowly, his face, his hair, and his eyes, which were filled with the depth of centuries of solitude and the warmth of newfound hope. I can see you, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I can see you, Lila. And in that moment, Lila knew. This was only the beginning. The curse had been broken, but their journey was far from over. Together, they would rebuild what had been lost and learn what it truly meant to be free. The eternal winter was finally melting away, and the promise of spring was within their reach. Chapter 7. The Promise of Spring. As the warmth from the shard continued to radiate through the palace, Lila stood in stunned silence, her heart racing. The cold that had once gripped the palace with an unyielding ferocity was slowly ebbing away, replaced by a soft, gentle warmth. The ice around them seemed to melt at an almost imperceptible rate, trickling down in tiny rivulets that sparkled as they caught the light. The air itself felt lighter, like the very atmosphere of the palace was breathing for the first time in centuries. Kael, now fully visible, stood before her, his form still shimmering faintly with the energy of the shard. His face was soft, his features just as Lila had imagined, young, with sharp, princely features framed by dark, tousled hair. But it was his eyes that drew her in. His eyes were deep pools of sorrow and hope, the kind of eyes that had seen the passage of endless years alone. For the first time, those eyes were fixed on her, not as a voice in the wind, not as an invisible presence, but as a person. Kael took a hesitant step forward, his form still flickering like a faint reflection in water, as though his newfound visibility was still being forged by the shard's magic. His voice, soft and full of wonder, filled the space between them. Lila, I can't believe it. You freed me. Lila smiled, her heart swelling with a joy she could hardly contain. It wasn't just me, Kael. You did this too. You gave me the strength to find you, to bring you back. He reached out, his hand trembling, as if he wasn't entirely sure he could trust his own presence. When his fingers brushed against hers, the warmth between them intensified, and it was as though the world outside the palace was waking up with them. The cold had not only begun to recede in the palace, but was now retreating from the land beyond. The unyielding winter that had bound Frosthaven in an eternal night was finally beginning to loosen its grip. Together, Kael whispered, we can finally bring an end to this. Bring back the sun. Lila nodded, her gaze soft with understanding. She could feel the weight of their shared mission, the responsibility of breaking the curse not just for Kael's sake, but for the entire kingdom. There was so much more to do, so many lives that had been affected by the curse, so much suffering that had been inflicted by the unending winter. But now, with the warmth of the shard between them, Lila felt that they were capable of anything. Kael looked around the room, his eyes falling on the slowly melting ice, his lips curling into a soft smile. I never imagined I'd see this again, he said, his voice filled with awe. The warmth of the sun, It feels so distant, but it's here now. I can feel it. Lila stepped back and gestured toward the great hall behind them. The walls of the palace were beginning to drip with melted water, the ice cracking in sharp, crisp sounds as it broke apart. The once still air was now alive with the sound of the melting ice, like the first breath of a new season. "We need to go outside," Lila said, her voice steady and resolute. "We need to see if the warmth has reached the land. Frosthaven must be feeling this change too." Kael's expression darkened for a moment, a shadow of the prince he once was. "I haven't been outside in so long," he said, his voice barely audible. "What will it be like? What if the curse still lingers in the land, even if the palace is free?" Lila placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "It's going to be all right. You've felt the change, haven't you? The warmth is already spreading. The land is waking up, just like you are. Together, we can bring back the seasons. We can restore the world." Kael met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet strength he hadn't known he possessed. "You're right. It's not over yet. But I believe in you, Lila. I believe in us." With a deep breath, they moved toward the entrance of the palace. As they stepped out into the open air, Lila was struck by the contrast before her. For years, Frosthaven had been trapped in an unyielding winter. The sky above had always been grey, the ground covered in thick, unmelting snow. Now, however, as they stepped into the courtyard, the air was no longer bitterly cold. It was crisp, refreshing, almost spring-like. The snow was melting around them, revealing patches of earth that had been buried for centuries. The trees in the distance, once frozen solid, now swayed gently in a light breeze, their branches swathed in soft, budding leaves. The distant mountains, once lost in a veil of snow, now stood proudly against the sky, their peaks free of the frozen weight that had once chained them in place. It's happening," Kael said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood beside her, his hand brushing the cold stone of the palace wall. "The world is thawing. It's coming back to life." Lila smiled as she turned to look at him. "The sun is just behind those clouds, Kael. It's waiting to shine again." They stood together, side by side, as the last traces of winter disappeared. The air was filled with the scent of earth and pine, the promise of renewal in the breeze that carried through the open courtyard. The world was waking up, just as Kael had, just as they both had. For the first time in his life, Kael felt something he had long since forgotten, the promise of a future not bound by the chains of his curse. The weight of centuries of loneliness was lifting from his heart, and in its place there was something new, something that had been kindled by Lila's warmth, by her courage, and by the shared bond they had forged in the face of darkness. Together, they had not only broken the curse, they had given the world a chance to heal. The eternal winter was gone, and with it came the dawn of a new beginning. The seasons would return, the sun would rise, and Frosthaven would once again know the warmth of spring. And for Kael, for Lila, this was only the start of a journey that would take them far beyond the Ice Palace, into a world full of possibilities they had never dared to imagine. As the sun began to break through the clouds, casting its golden rays over the land, Kael took Lila's hand in his. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for bringing the warmth back to my life." Lila squeezed his hand gently. "We've only just begun, Kael. There's so much more for us to discover." And with that, they walked forward together, leaving the palace of ice behind them, their hearts full of hope and the promise of a new world. The spring had come, Chapter 8. The Awakening. The first light of dawn filtered through the soft mist that clung to the air, painting the landscape in hues of gold and pink. The warmth of the sun, once a distant memory in Frosthaven, now kissed the earth gently, as if the world itself was stretching after a long, endless slumber. Lila stood at the edge of the courtyard, her eyes scanning the land that stretched before her, a land that had once been frozen in perpetual winter, now slowly coming back to life. Beside her, Kael stood, his form now solid and whole, no longer flickering like a mirage. He had come into himself, his full presence grounding the space around them. The wind tugged at his hair, and his breath came easily in the crisp, clean air. For the first time in so long, his heart felt light, as though a great weight had been lifted from him. "We did it," Kael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The curse is gone. The land is waking up." Lila smiled, her fingers brushing through the soft new grass that had begun to sprout around them. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice quiet with awe. "I never imagined it could look like this again." Together, they walked down the steps of the palace, their footsteps making faint impressions in the soft earth, where the snow had already begun to melt. The once frozen river that ran through the valley now flowed with fresh water, its gentle current sparkling as it caught the early morning light. The trees that had stood silent and still for so long were now filled with the rustle of leaves, the promise of life returning. Kael looked out at the horizon, his gaze distant, as though he could see not just the land before him, but all the years that had passed in its frozen grip. "I spent so many years inside that palace," he said softly. "I had no idea if there would ever be a time when things could be different." Lila placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "Now we know," she said gently. "Things can change, and you don't have to face it alone anymore." Kael turned to her, his eyes soft, a hint of vulnerability in them. "I never thought I would find someone like you. You brought me back to life, Lila. I'm not sure I'll ever be able to repay you for that." Lila laughed softly, the sound light and comforting. "You don't have to repay me. I didn't do it for that. We did this together. You gave me the courage to keep going." As they continued their walk through the land, the changes in the world around them became more evident. The fields that had been barren and frozen were now slowly revealing green shoots. The snow that had once blanketed everything in a harsh, unyielding white had receded, leaving behind the soft brown earth. Birds, long absent from the sky, were now returning in flocks, their songs filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. The atmosphere was electric with possibility. It was as though everything had been waiting for this moment, for the warmth to return, for the curse to be broken. But even as the land healed, Kael's thoughts remained heavy. "Lila," he began, his voice distant. "There's something I need to tell you. I know we've broken the curse, and I know the land is healing, but there's still something I'm afraid of." Lila turned to him, her brow furrowing with concern. "What do you mean?" Kael took a deep breath, the weight of his past pressing on him again. The curse was only one part of the kingdom's suffering. While the ice has melted from the palace and the land is coming back to life, there are many people in Frosthaven who have lived their entire lives under the shadow of the cold. I've seen the toll it's taken on them. I fear that even with the return of the seasons, there is still much that has been lost. Lila's heart tightened. She had known that breaking the curse was only the first step, but hearing Kael voice his fears made the weight of their mission feel heavier than ever. The kingdom of Frosthaven had endured a lifetime of suffering, and now, with the world beginning to awaken, it was time to heal the scars that ran deep within the people. Kael's gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains in the distance. I don't know how to help them. How do we make things right after all this time? Lila took a moment before responding, her voice steady and filled with resolve. We start by offering hope. We start by showing them that there is more to life than what they've known. The land is healing, and so can they. But it will take time, Kael. It will take time for them to trust in the warmth again. Kael nodded, but his gaze remained uncertain. But how do we reach them? How do we make them see that things have changed? Lila placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him again. One person at a time, the warmth is spreading through the land, but we can't forget that it has to come from within too. We can't rush them, Kael. All we can do is be there for them. You, more than anyone, can show them that change is possible. You've lived through the cold. You've felt the bitterness of isolation. You're proof that even the darkest winters come to an end. Kael looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had always carried the burden of being the cursed prince, the one who was trapped in the cold. But now, for the first time, he could see a way forward, not just for him, but for the people of Frosthaven. You're right, Kael said, his voice soft. We will go to them. We'll show them that there is warmth, not just in the world, but in themselves. Lila smiled, her heart full. Exactly, and we'll do it together. As they walked through the thawing land, side by side, they knew the work was far from over. But in that moment, surrounded by the signs of a world reborn, they felt the weight of the future settle on their shoulders with a sense of purpose. Together, they would help the people of Frosthaven heal. Together, they would make the promise of spring a reality for everyone, not just the land, but for every heart still bound by the cold. The world was awakening, and so too were they, no longer bound by the past, but free to embrace the future. The promise of spring was not just the return of the seasons, but the return of hope itself, and as they moved forward, hand in hand, they knew they were not alone. Chapter 9. The Heart of Frosthaven. Days passed, and the changes in the kingdom were undeniable. The snow, once unyielding and bitter, had been replaced by soft, spring-like rains that soaked the ground and nourished the newly sprouting vegetation. The once frozen fields were now dotted with wildflowers and tall grasses, their vibrant colours painting the land in hues of yellow, purple, and green. The mountains, their peaks now free from the weight of endless snow, stood as silent sentinels watching over the land's transformation. Kael and Lila had spent their time travelling across Frosthaven, visiting the villages that lay scattered throughout the kingdom. They had walked through fields that were now alive with the promise of growth, passed by homes where once dejected souls were now gathering together, laughing in the warmth of a newfound season. It was as if the very essence of the land had been reborn, and with it, the hearts of the people. But not everything had returned to normal. Despite the clear signs of life returning to the kingdom, there were still remnants of the old curse lingering in the hearts of those who had lived their entire lives under the cold. Many villagers still hesitated to trust the warmth that now bathed their homes, unsure if the seasons had truly returned, or if the curse might one day return to claim them once more. One particular village, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines, stood out to Kael and Lila. The people here were kind, but weary. They had seen the long years of the curse stretch on, with no end in sight, and the thawing of the land felt too sudden for them to accept without doubt. The children played in the soft grass, but the adults lingered by their homes, casting wary glances toward the sky. The village felt like it was caught between two worlds, one still steeped in the cold of the past, and another struggling to embrace the promise of a warm future. Kael stood at the edge of the village square, his gaze scanning the crowd. "They're afraid," he said, his voice low, filled with the weight of understanding. "They've been living with the cold for so long that the warmth feels unnatural to them." Lila placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's going to take time, Kael. They've been waiting for this day for so long, but they've also been hurt. Trust doesn't come easily after years of living in fear." Kael nodded, his eyes softening. He could see the fear in the eyes of the villagers. They had spent so long in the grip of the curse that even the sight of the sun breaking through the clouds was not enough to ease their worries. But he also knew that they needed hope, real hope, to help them heal, to help them move past the shadow that had haunted their lives for so long. The village elder, an older woman named Elira, approached them, her steps slow and deliberate. Her hair was silver, and her face was lined with the wisdom of many winters. She had been the heart of the village through all the years of cold, guiding the people with a steady hand. But now, there was a sadness in her eyes. "Elira," Kael greeted her softly, bowing his head in respect. "It's good to see you." Elira gave him a small, weary smile. "The pleasure is mine, Your Highness," she said, her voice full of kindness but edged with concern. "But there is much we need to discuss. The thawing of the land has brought much hope, but there is still much fear in the hearts of my people. We have lived with the cold for so long, we do not know how to embrace the warmth." Lila stepped forward, her expression gentle but firm. "We understand, Elira. We're not asking you to forget the past, but we're here to show you that the world has changed, that the cold you've lived with is over. The warmth is not an illusion. It's real, and it's here to stay." The elder looked at her with an intensity that made Lila's heart skip. "And how can you prove this to us, child? How do you expect us to trust that the cold won't return? We have seen the sun rise many times, only to be swallowed by endless clouds and ice. What is different this time?" Kael stepped forward, his voice steady and full of conviction. "I have lived the curse. I know what it's like to feel the weight of an eternal winter pressing on your soul, but I also know that things can change. The warmth has returned, not just to the land, but to me. It has returned to all of us, but it will take time, Elira. It will take time for the land and for the hearts of the people to fully heal." Elira studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "And what is it that you ask of us, Kael? What can we do to help this healing along?" Lila spoke next, her voice filled with the softness of understanding. "We need you to trust. Trust that the warmth is real. Trust that the cold is gone. We can't force anyone to believe, but we can be here to help guide them. We need to lead by example, to show them that together we can rebuild what was lost." There was a long silence between them, the weight of the moment settling over them like the first cool breeze of spring. Then Elira nodded slowly, as if a great burden had lifted from her shoulders. "You're right," she said, her voice quieter now, filled with the wisdom of years. "The people of this village have known nothing but the cold. We have kept ourselves wrapped in our fears, but perhaps it is time to let go. Perhaps it is time to believe in the warmth again." Kael smiled, a soft, grateful expression that reached his eyes. "We'll do it together, and we'll be here every step of the way." The elder nodded, turning to the people who had gathered at the edge of the square. "Come," she called, her voice firm but kind. "It is time to embrace the spring. Let us welcome the warmth back into our lives." And with that, the villagers slowly began to gather around, their faces unsure but hopeful. As they stood together in the center of the village, the sun broke through the last of the clouds, casting its golden rays over them all. Kael and Lila stood side by side, watching as the people began to talk, laugh, and share their hopes for the future. It was a quiet moment, but it was a beginning of trust, of healing, and of the return of a brighter, warmer world. For the first time, Kael felt the weight of the past truly lifting. He was no longer just the cursed prince. He was part of something much larger. He was part of a kingdom that was awakening from its long winter, and together they would build something new, something stronger than anything that had come before. As the villagers gathered around, the warmth of the sun on their faces, Lila turned to Kael with a smile. "This is just the start, isn't it?" she asked softly. Kael nodded, his heart full of hope. "Yes, this is only the beginning." And with that, they stood together, watching as the kingdom of Frosthaven embraced the warmth that had once seemed impossible, knowing that the journey ahead would be one of unity, growth, and a future that was finally free from the cold. Chapter 10. A New Dawn. The days that followed were full of small, quiet moments that spoke of deep change. Frosthaven, the kingdom once trapped in eternal winter, was beginning to look more like a land that had never known the cold at all. The land blossomed with new life, and with each passing day, the people grew more hopeful. They worked together in the fields, repairing their homes, and planting crops for the first time in many years. The fear that had held them captive for so long was slowly being replaced by something new. Trust. Kael and Lila remained at the heart of this transformation. They travelled from village to village, helping the people of Frosthaven understand that the curse was not a shadow that would return, but a relic of the past. They spoke of the warmth that had been reclaimed, not just in the world around them, but in their hearts. It was a slow journey, but one that felt right. With every village they visited, they saw the fear begin to dissipate, replaced by a quiet but growing optimism. But for Kael, there was still a deep feeling within him that he couldn't shake. Even as the kingdom healed, he knew there was still something more to be done. A kingdom could heal physically, with the earth and seasons changing. But there was something deeper that needed attention. The people needed more than just warmth. They needed unity. They needed a sense of belonging. And most of all, they needed a new kind of leadership. The journey back to the palace was a quiet one. The land around them had fully embraced the change, the trees now swaying in a warm breeze, the rivers running free and clear. The once proud palace, now standing tall against the landscape, looked like something out of a fairy tale. The ice that had encased it was long gone, replaced by warm stone and soft gardens that had taken root where the cold had once ruled. It was a place of beauty now, a reminder of how far they had come. As they stood in front of the palace, Lila turned to Kael, her gaze full of understanding. "You're thinking about the future, aren't you?" Kael nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the quiet intensity of his thoughts. "I am. The people here, they're still trying to find their place in this new world. We've broken the curse, but now we need to build something that will keep the warmth alive. I can't do it alone, Lila." Lila stepped closer to him, placing her hand gently over his. "You don't have to. You've already done so much, Kael. The people believe in you. They've already seen how far you've come. But now, it's time to let them help shape the future with you. You can't carry all of this alone." Kael looked down at her hand on his, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so many years trapped in his own fear, trapped in the ice that had kept him apart from the world. But now, standing beside Lila, He realized that the warmth he had sought for so long was not just in the world around him, it was in the connections he had made, the people he had brought together, and the unity that was being forged with every new day. "I can't do this without them," Kael murmured. "Without all of us working together, we'll never be able to make this kingdom whole again." Lila smiled softly. "And that's why they need you. You are their leader, Kael, but you're also their friend, and that's what will make all the difference." Kael stood in silence, taking in the quiet beauty of the palace and the land around him. He had spent so many years alone, his heart weighed down by the curse that had isolated him. But now the future felt bright and full of promise. The world was no longer a frozen wasteland. It was a land of possibility, a land where hope could grow as easily as the grass underfoot. And as the days passed, Kael did something he never thought he would. He called for a gathering in the heart of the kingdom. The people from every village, young and old, were invited to the palace grounds. There, in the warmth of the sun, he would speak to them, not as a prince bound by the chains of a curse, but as a leader who understood the weight of the past and the importance of the future. The day of the gathering arrived, and the people of Frosthaven filled the courtyard, their faces eager and hopeful, but still uncertain. The air was filled with the murmur of voices, and for the first time, Kael felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. He was no longer just the prince of a kingdom lost in cold. He was the symbol of a new beginning. Kael stood at the center of the crowd, his heart beating steadily in his chest. Lila was by his side, her presence a grounding force that helped him find his calm. The people were waiting for him to speak, to guide them toward the future. "People of Frosthaven," Kael began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We have spent many years under the weight of the cold, waiting for the warmth to return. And now that warmth is here. But it is not just the warmth of the sun, nor the spring that comes with the thaw. It is the warmth we bring to each other. It is the warmth of our hearts, our hope, and our strength. Together, we can build a kingdom that is stronger than ever before." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Kael took a deep breath before continuing. "I know that many of you are still afraid. I know that trust does not come easily, especially after so many years of suffering. But I promise you this, I will not lead you alone. We will lead each other. We will rebuild Frosthaven, not just with our hands, but with our hearts. Together, we can create a kingdom where everyone belongs, where no one is left behind in the cold. A kingdom where warmth and kindness are not just for the seasons, but for all of us." The crowd remained silent for a moment, the weight of Kael's words settling in. Then slowly, the people began to cheer. The sound rose in volume, a chorus of voices united in a single powerful moment of hope. Kael smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He had not done this alone. He had done this with the help of the people, with the warmth of their belief, and with the support of Lila, who had always been by his side. And in that moment, Kael realized that this was what he had always needed. The strength that came from unity, from working together to create something greater than any one individual could achieve. The kingdom was no longer defined by the curse of the past. It was defined by the people who had come together to heal, to grow, and to build a new future. The sun set over Frosthaven, casting a warm golden light over the land. The first stars began to twinkle in the sky, a sign that the night, like the winter, was coming to an end. And as Kael stood with Lila by his side, surrounded by the people of the kingdom, he knew that this was only the beginning. The world had been reborn, and with it, the promise of a brighter future. Together, they would build a new dawn for Frosthaven, one filled with warmth, hope, and the unshakable belief that anything was possible when they stood united.